And I hope everybody's got all your Christmas stuff ready. This is as I was going through this lesson, and if we get a chance to get to chapter 9, you'll see that the Christmas story is pretty clear in this in the Old Testament. That term Emmanuel hopefully will mean a little something different when you understand what Hebrews means in the New Covenant and the Old Covenant. So we've been looking at Hebrews. We started in Hebrews chapter 7. Oops, let me turn this on. And we looked at Melchizedek, and we looked at how Jesus is after the order of Melchizedek when it comes to his priesthood. I'm going to bring that up again because we're talking about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. What are some of the components of the Old Covenant? What would the Old Covenant require? What were some of the things that we know about the Old Covenant? There was a sacrifice, and then to have a sacrifice, you had to have a priest, right? You have to have a priest to offer the sacrifice. We talked about the role of the priest was to be that in between the people and God, to be able to communicate or to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people, but also to communicate what God had said to the people. And so we see the sacrifice. We also see, and we'll talk more about this today, is the tabernacle, is the place that they offer those sacrifices. So we see that we start out with Melchizedek, and he spent a whole chapter on Melchizedek talking about how Christ was the better of Melchizedek. He's after that same order. We spent last week, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but I wanted to bring it up because it's foundational to understanding what we're talking about in chapter 8 and chapter 9. Because chapter 8 and 9 talk about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So to understand the New Covenant, you have to understand the Old Covenant. So we looked at Abraham's covenant, which established a new people. The idea that it was that God had no people. He had all the people, but he wanted a people to dwell with, a people to be with. And he established that covenant with Abraham to become a new people. And that was a prophetic covenant. We also saw David's covenant, which establishes the Messiah's royalty. Okay, so I pulled those two out separately because what kind of covenants were those? Were those one-way covenants or two-way covenants? One way. Remember, God had given the promise to Abraham, you will be my people. I will make a people out of you. What about David? I will make a king out of you. Your lineage will be royalty. So we see that those are one-way covenants. And then we see the covenant with Moses. And that covenant with Moses establishes God's relationship. It establishes God's ability to come dwell with the people. Now, this is important when we think about the New Covenant and the Old Covenant, because this is where the Old Covenant rests upon. He says, we looked at the covenant, the promise of Moses was the very presence of God to dwell with them. You think about that. We talk about it in the temple. We'll look at this again in the tabernacle, but I want you to continue to think about that today in this lesson. Is that the Old Covenant and the New Covenant deal with the presence of God in our lives. The Old Covenant, where was the presence of God? And the holiest of holies in the tabernacle. In the New Covenant, we'll look at, he changes that. He dwells them within us. The idea that fellowship was conditional. It required them to do what? It required them to sacrifice. It required them to come in as holy, to make atonement for their sins. But we also saw that the law wasn't what saved, but it was a pattern of salvation. It was a thing that showed the expectation that God had. He said, I will make you a nation of what? A nation of, he said it to the people, just what's required to communicate with God at the time? Who did they have to have? They had to have a priest, right? I'll make you a nation of priests. Did he mean that everybody was going to offer sacrifices for the people around them? No, what did he mean? He was talking about he was going to communicate to the people around them through them, right? They were going to be the go-between between the world around them and God. So God expected certain things of them. He had standards that he expected for them to uphold to. And that's what we see when he talks about this idea that they were to follow the law. The law was going to set the expectation of who God was. It was going to show God's character to the people around them. But we know the people failed to represent God to the world. That covenant was broken by the people. We see that in Exodus chapter 33. And actually, I didn't share all this in this lesson because I don't want to spend time going back. But Exodus chapter 33, they were standing before the promised land. And what did God say? God said, you know what? I'm so tired of you. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I'm so tired of you. I'm going to send you into the promised land. You're going to get the land that I promised you because I'm going to keep my word. But who is he going to send ahead of him? Anybody read Exodus 33? Who is he going to send ahead of him, ahead with them? God was willing to send an angel into the promised land with them. God says, I'm not going to lead you. You want the promised land. I can give you the blessings that you want, but you're not going to have me with you. And it's interesting, in Exodus 33, the people mourned, and they realized that they were losing God to get his blessings. And so that's when we talk about the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant wasn't about the blessings of God as a nation of Israel. It was about the presence of God that went with them. And they broke that. The people, eventually, what happened to the people? Eventually. What happened to the temple? It was destroyed, and the people were taken into captivity, remember? And they lost that first covenant. So there's a new covenant established. And we looked at those prophetic passages in Isaiah and Jeremiah. We'll look at a couple of those again today, because we'll be talking more about the new covenant today. But that new covenant was about redemption. It was about a better promise. And you'll hear that often today, about a better promise and about a better covenant. So let's get started. Oh, and I did mention the reason why I give that whole chart is because what's the new covenant? The new covenant is a fulfillment of the old covenants. We think about even Adam and Noah. They were all preparing the way for Christ. Christ wasn't, again, the second thought. Christ was the intention. The new covenant wasn't new because it needed to be new. It wasn't like, I want a new car. It was the new covenant was the intended covenant. That was everything was pointing towards. The law did what? It was their school teacher. It taught them about what the new covenant was going to bring, what their need was for the new covenant. And so keep that in mind. That's the new covenant wasn't a second thought. It was the better covenant that was to come. All right, so let's look at the nature of the old covenant. First, we see that in Hebrews chapter 1, it says, now the things which you have spoken, this is the sum, which we have a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty of heavens. Here he's summing up chapter 7. What was chapter 7 about? I just mentioned it. Or who was chapter 7 about? Melchizedek, remember the priest, the priest of the Most High God, Melchizedek. Melchizedek had no beginning and he had no end, as recorded in the Bible. So just like Christ, there is no successor, and no predecessor, and no successor to his priesthood. And it says, now we have such a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heavens. He's summing up what they just talked about, as Christ being the high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And he puts him in a place, because this is important what he's going to talk about today. He says, where is Christ? On the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heavens. Look at verse 2. He says, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not men. So he's setting up what he's going to talk about in this chapter. And he says there, a minister of the sanctuary of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not of men. What is the true tabernacle? Where is Christ? Where's he in verse 1? He's at the right hand of God. Right now, Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. He's sitting in the throne room of God. What was the tabernacle? We talked about that before. It wasn't just a religious space, but what was it on earth?
The presence of the dwelling place of Shekinah.
Yeah, it was a dwelling place of God. It was a dwelling place. It wasn't just a dwelling place, but it was his throne room, if you think about it that way. It was the place on earth that he came down and sat and communed with man. And this is so we think of who Christ is. Who is Christ? Where is Christ right now? Sitting in the throne room of God. He's sitting on the right hand of God. He says there, a minister of the sanctuary of the true tabernacle, which who pitched? The Lord pitched, and not man. He's not talking about sitting on a tabernacle on earth. He's not sitting in the temple in Jerusalem. He's sitting in heaven, which is the tabernacle that the Lord pitched. Then we see we're going to talk about that priesthood again. So he puts the setting, and we'll talk more about the setting in a minute, about the true tabernacle. But he says, for every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, wherefore it is necessary that this man have somewhat also to offer. For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law. Christ was was a priest after the order of who? Melchizedek. By the time we're done with this series, you should be able to say Melchizedek really easily. We joked about it. That's a success in this series, if you can say Melchizedek without getting stumbled. But he says he was after the order of Melchizedek. Now he says that the priest on earth had to offer gifts according to the law. So remember, he's still comparing here how better Christ is compared to Melchizedek. He says they're necessary that he have somewhat also to offer. He's not going to answer that yet of what Christ is going to have to offer. But he's setting that up. He's pointing out Christ is going to have to offer something to be a priest of the Most High God. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5. He says, who serve also the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, he saith, that thou shalt make all things according to the pattern shown unto thee in the mount. That's interesting. So Moses, he says there Moses was making things after a shadow of heavenly things. That means Moses saw the tabernacle somewhere else. He had seen something that looked like the tabernacle that he was going to create on earth. He says that thou shalt make all things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. Where was Moses when he saw this tabernacle? On the Mount of Sinai. Who was he communing with? He was communing with God. He was communing with God. He saw a glimpse of what that tabernacle looked like. We'll come back to the tabernacle. Keep that in mind. He says a better covenant. Now he hath obtained a more excellent ministry. By how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. Okay, so he says there are better covenant and better promises. What if I offered today to Brother Willie? I said, Brother Willie, I can give you a house today. And you're going to get it's a 400 square foot house. It's might have an indoor bathroom. You hadn't really seen it yet, but it's a small house. And you said, okay, that's great, but it's free, right? It comes on. We'll give you 20 acres. So you got plenty of land if you want to expand. You know, okay, yeah, that's great. That's a great promise. I'll give it to you first of the year. You can come get it next week. Brother Willie's like, that's great. Now, what if I came back and said, Brother Willie, I'm going to give you a mansion. It's going to be 20,000 square foot. Set on 100 acres, your own ranch, your own horse lot. Which would you choose if I gave you a better promise? The better promise, right? And that's what he's telling them here. He says there's a promise that they were given. You know, it had land, right? It had shelter. It had all the elements there, but it wasn't the same. And so he says there, now he's obtained a more excellent ministry. He is also the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. We'll see here in a minute why God's covenant was a better promise. But keep that in mind. That's what he's talking about. These Israelites were holding on to, the Hebrew Christians were holding on to what? The old promise. They were holding on to an old promise that required them to work, required them to sacrifice, that required them to do things that God wasn't expecting them to do. And they were doing it for ultimately for the wrong reasons. So let's look here. Let's see the need. Oh, I forgot this part. I had two pictures I used to keep in my wallet. I don't really keep a wallet anymore, but I used to keep this in my wallet. Anybody know what this is? Rachel should. This was our first date, and as awkward as that picture is, my parents taking a picture on our first date. We're actually chaperoning prom, and so we got all dressed up to go. But I kept that picture for a long time in my wallet. I held on to it. I would look at it, because we were dating, and she was living on the south side, or was living or working on the south side for that summer. And I would look at that picture, and I think, man, she's beautiful. I'd check out that picture all the time. But eventually, I got to marry that person. Now, would it be better that I hold on to that picture and keep staring at that picture and say, man, that's a great picture. She is beautiful. I hope I get to marry her one day when she's sitting right next to me. Like, that's what he's talking about when he says better promises. There was a vision of something to come. That smile, I get to see that smile. I wish I could see that smile every day. Oh, I can't. I can stare at this picture. Or I could turn, right, and I could see that smile. And that's the idea he's talking about. I thought about this. These are always fun to try and figure out what they are. But most people know it's a baby. And I think of who Noah was. Before we met Noah, there was a sonogram that we got. And I see the sonogram. I'm like, oh, this is my kid. This is my girl. And to think about what that meant. And to think, this is a promise to come, right? It was shadow. That's about what I thought of shadow. I was like, that's a shadow of things to come, right? I don't know what she's going to be like, but I know it's really good, right? God has promised this. But yet, what if she's 9 now, and what if I just spent my time, when she wants me to read her a book, I go and pull out the picture, and I read a book to the picture. I spend time with the picture. I talk to the picture. Oh, Nora, how's your day today? That would be really weird, right? It would be really sad because that's not the better promise, right? That was only a promise of things to come. So we think about the tabernacle and the desire of the people to come to the tabernacle or to keep having the temple and keep going to worship at the temple. That's what the Israelites were doing. That's what the Hebrew Christians were doing. They wanted the temple back. They wanted to go sacrifice and dwell with God and have him come down and dwell in the temple. But you know what? There was a better promise. And they were missing the better promise. So let's see what that better promise was. See, first off, we see that there was a faulty old covenant. In Hebrews verse 7, it says, For that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant in the house of Israel and in the house of Judah, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. So here we see that there was this covenant was considered faulty. He says there was a first covenant that had been, if the first covenant had been faultless. He says, but he says, you know what? Look at verse 8. He says, for finding fault with who? With them. Was the fault in the giver of the covenant or the receiver of the covenant? It was in the receiver of the covenant. See, the people didn't keep the covenant that God had established. He says that covenant was faulty. He says at the bottom, because they continued what? Not in my covenant, and I regarded not them, saith the Lord. Remember, we talked about this was a two-way covenant. I will dwell with you if you keep my covenant. That's what God told him. And the people did not keep his covenant, so God did not dwell with them. Look at Exodus, chapter 19, verse 3. It says, And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, This thou shalt say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Remember, we talked about that was the covenant that God had made to him. If ye shall obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, you'll be a peculiar treasure above all people. What happened to the nation of Israel? Did they keep his covenant? No, we know he didn't. So there was a need. So look at Ezekiel. We see the need for the new covenant. It says, For thus saith the Lord God, I will even deal with them as thou hast done. Thou hast despised the oath and breaking the covenant. Nevertheless, I will remember my covenant with thee in the days of thy youth, and I will establish unto thee an everlasting covenant. Again, remember he's talking about the old covenant and a better covenant. What if I offered to Brother Willie, I said, Brother Willie, you can have that house, but I don't know how long you'll have that house. As long as you call me every day, we talk, you tell me how things are going, you can keep that house. Or what if I said, Brother Will, you can have a bigger house, a better house, and it's yours to keep forever? Which is the better covenant? That's what he's comparing here. He says, one required him to do something to keep in communion, to make sure the house was being kept up, or just making sure everything was taken care of, that he represented me well in that neighborhood. The other says what? It's an everlasting covenant. There's nothing that can break this covenant. I will establish unto thee an everlasting covenant. Then thou shalt remember thy ways and be ashamed. Then thou shalt receive thy sisters, thine elders, and thy younger, and I will give them unto thee for daughters, but not by thy covenant. And I will establish my covenant with thee, and thou shalt know that I am the Lord. Again, God said, I'm going to establish the covenant with thee, and thou shalt know I'm the Lord. This is about God, under the relationship that he has with his people and the new covenant that he was going to establish. So back in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 10, it says, For this is the new covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws in their mouth and write them in their hearts. And I will be unto them a God, and ye shall be unto me a people. And thou shalt not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me from the least to the greatest. That should be a very familiar verse. Do y'all remember this from last week? If you go back to Jeremiah, Go and turn to back in Jeremiah chapter 31. And the writer of Hebrews here continues to quote. We'll see here in this passage that he's quoting directly from as he was reminding the Hebrews of what Jeremiah said about the new covenant. He's showing them this isn't something I just made up, right? As the writer of Hebrews. He's saying this is what was prophesied by Jeremiah. He's in Jeremiah 31, it says, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers, and the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was a husband unto them, saith the Lord." And in verse 33, "But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my law in their inward parts and write in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know of me, from the least unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." So think of what that new covenant means. He's telling them there, he says, for the new covenant is important. It's not that I want to go create a new law. He's not going to send someone back up into the mountain to go get tablets again. What's he say? I will write the laws in their mind. Let's go back to verse 10. I will write the laws in their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be unto them a God, and they shall be to me a people. Where's the law going to be? Where did the law dwell? Let's start there. Where did they keep the law? In the Ark of the Covenant. Remember, they kept it with the Ark of the Covenant. It went with the temple, or went with the tabernacle. Where was the law going to be now? In our hearts, right? He says the law is going to be in our hearts. So if the law was where God dwelt, where do you think where the law is now, where is God going to? If the law was where God dwelt when it was in the tabernacle, now God's putting the law where? In our hearts. Where do you think God is going to dwell? In our hearts. So we see there, he says, and write them in the heart so they may be able to be a people unto me. And then remember that verse 11 we talked about. He doesn't mean that we shouldn't teach anybody about God. What's he say? We don't have to, for all shall know me from the least unto the greatest. He talks about the idea that's currently understanding that we as individual believers can know who God is, right? We don't have to go through a priest to get to know who God is. But that's also talking prophetically, because one day every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall confess that the Lord is God. And we see that he shall know me from the least unto the greatest. That the least of us, the most undeserving of us, can know God. When it came to the priest, in the old covenant, who could know God? Just the priest, right? And it wasn't just the priest, but what priest? The high priest, right? They were the only ones that could go into the temple and get to actually commune with God. As a believer, who can commune with God? The 5-year-old, the child can commune with God. The undeserving one, the one that's forgiven of greatest sins, can commune with God. He writes his law in our hearts. Look at Hebrews verse 12. Sorry. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. And that he saith, a new covenant he hath made the first old, and that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. The idea that new covenant, he's like, I don't even want you to think about that old covenant anymore. This covenant is so good, it doesn't even compare. It's like putting a bicycle next to a Ferrari. It's like if I ever offer you, which one do you want? You're like, oh, I'm never riding a bike again. It's like if I could ride that every day. But he says that old covenant will pass away. It was made old and decayeth and waxes old and is ready to vanish away. He says, why? Because what's offered in verse 12? Forgiveness of sins. He says, I'll be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins, their iniquities will I remember no more. Remember we talked about the old covenant. In the old covenant, what was required of them continually? Sacrifices, continually atoning for sins, continually getting rid of cleansing of their sins. He says, but their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. Look at Psalms, verse 103. He says that he hath made known his ways unto Moses, his acts unto the children of Israel. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and plenteous in mercy. He will not always chide, neither will he keep his anger forever. He hath not dealt with us after our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities. For as the heaven is high above the earth, so great is his mercy toward them that fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far hath he removed our transgressions from us. He's talking about the new covenant there. He's talking about that, what God is providing when it comes to salvation. He says, because his anger will not continue forever. Neither will he keep his anger forever in verse 9. But that's the blessing of the new covenant. That's the promise, the better promises that he's offered. So actually we're going to move into chapter 9. So that's chapter 8. Chapter 9 we see he continues on and he talks about the tabernacle. He says, then verily the first covenant had also ordinances of divine sacrifices and a worldly sanctuary. What was the worldly sanctuary in the old covenant? The tabernacle, right? The old tabernacle. He says, for there was a tabernacle made, the first wherein was the candlestick and the table and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary, and after the veil and the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid round with gold, wherein was the gold pot that had manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant, and over it the cherubims of glory, showing the mercy seat, of which we cannot speak particularly. He's describing almost nostalgically to the Hebrew people what the tabernacle was like. He's describing the pieces in there. He's part of the ways I think in some ways he's showing his understanding of the old covenant to the Hebrew people, that he's not just someone that has forgotten the old ways, but he's describing what that's like. He says, for there was a tabernacle made. It's interesting. He says there a tabernacle made. Who made the tabernacle in the old covenant? Man did, right? God gave him the design. God gave Moses the design, but man made the tabernacle. He says now in verse 6. So we think of what the tabernacle is. He says now when these things were thus ordained, the priest went also into the tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God. But unto the second went the high priest alone, once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the heirs of the people. It's interesting there. He's setting up a conversation around the perfect sacrifice, and he's reminding them of the tabernacle and how it functioned. And he says there, but unto the second he's talking the holiest of holies, went the high priest alone once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the heirs of the people. In the old covenant, the priest had to offer sacrifices for who? Themselves and the people, right? Remember, he says the priest wouldn't go in there without blood, right? What would happen if the priest went in there without blood? He would die, right? He wouldn't be atoned for his sins. He wouldn't be able to enter into the presence of the Lord. He says, he offered for himself and for the heirs of the people. Oops, I hit that button. He says the Holy Ghost, this signifying that the way into the holiest of the Holy Ghost, this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not made yet manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing, which was a figure of the time then present, in which he offered both gifts and sacrifices, that could not make him that did the service perfect, as pertaining to the conscience. Okay, so he says that the Holy Ghost, you see there a comma, he comes back to it later, says that the way into the holiest of holies was not yet made manifest, while the first tabernacle was yet standing. What did he say? So we could get into the we could get into the Holy of Holies, but who could? Just the high priest. Remember, that's what he sets up in verse 7 and verse 6, that only the high priest could go in once a year to atone for the people's sin, or with atonement for himself and for the heirs of the people. But he says the Holy Ghost, and he's talking about the Holy Ghost, will this signify that the way into the Holy of Holies was not yet made manifest. Not made manifest for who? For everyone, right? For the people. He says, while the first tabernacle was standing, which was a figure of the time then present, in which would he offer both gifts and sacrifices, that could not make him that did the service perfect, as pertaining to the conscience. Again, what would happen to the priest? Was the priest made perfect because of the sacrifice? No. The sacrifice just covered his sins. But what would happen to his conscience the next year? He would continue to sin. Remember, he says that conscience was not made perfect, which stood only in meats and drinks and divers washings and carnal ordinances imposed on them until the time of Reformation. He says there was something better to come. What was their offerings focused on? Earthly things. If you notice there, he says meats and drinks and divers washings and carnal ordinances imposed on them at the time of Reformation. The first covenant had a limited reach. The first covenant was limited, wasn't it? Could it save mankind? No, it was a shadow of things to come. It pointed to who Christ would be, or what salvation was. So let's look at the better sacrifice. It says, but Christ, being come as high priest of good conscience, of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered once into the holy place, having attained eternal redemption for us. Let's look at that again. Let's break that down a little bit. He says, but Christ, being come a high priest of good things to come. We see that Christ was the high priest out of what order? Melchizedek. Remember, he says, so Christ become a high priest of good things to come. And how did he become the order of Melchizedek? By who? Who made him the high priest after the order of Melchizedek? We looked at it 2 weeks ago. By an oath of who? Oath of God. Remember, God out of oath made him of the order of Melchizedek. So with God's authority, he became a high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place. Again, comparing him to the Levitical priest. How often the Levitical priest, or what did the Levitical priest have to offer to be able to enter into the Holy of Holies? Animal sacrifices. Remember, the priest couldn't offer his own blood because what? It was sinned. It was tainted. It was stained with sin. He says he entered into the Holy of Holies by his own blood. He entered in once in the Holy of Holies, or in the holy place, having obtained what? Eternal redemption for us. This is the better promise. The better promise is that Christ is the one who is able to enter into the Holy of Holies and receive eternal redemption. Look at this. This actually changed my perspective on this verse. John chapter 1, verse 14. I know you can quote it. And the Lord was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten Father, full of grace and truth. We look at that word, dwelt among us. Do you know what dwelt among us is the same word that's used, or same usage? This was used as a verb, but as a noun, do you know what that same verb is? Tabernacle. It says the word of God, the word was made flesh and dwelt among us, like the tabernacle. Think about this. What was the tabernacle? It was the holiest of holies. It was the presence of God on earth. What was Christ to us? It was the presence of God on earth. And so sometimes I read that and we stop and then we skip down and say, dwelt among us, full of grace and truth, because there's a parenthesis. So it looks like we can skip that. But read that parenthesis again. We beheld his glory, the glory as the only begotten of the Father. In the old covenant, who was able to behold the glory of the only begotten of the Father? Just the priest. Think about that verse for a second. So Christ was made flesh, dwelt among us, and we beheld the glory of God as a priest going into the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. That's who Christ is. It changed my perspective. I don't know if it hit you. I got goosebumps when I read this again the second time. I'm like, wait, he's describing the old covenant as John's talking here about the Word being made flesh, full of what? Grace and truth. We got to see, through Christ, we can see who God is. And it's in that parentheses isn't just a parentheses that kind of says, oh, by the way. That was a parentheses that says, dwelt among us. Don't miss this. This is like the tabernacle when you could go see when the high priest went in to see God in the holiest of holies. That's what he's talking. We beheld his glory as the glory of the only begotten of the Father. We see there the new covenant requires a greater sacrifice. In verse 13, it says, for if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of heifers sprinkling the unclean sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ? Let that sit for a second. It says, for the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean, sanctifying to the purifying of flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ? Was Christ better than bulls and goats and ashes of heifers? Absolutely. Why was Christ better? Because he was sinless. He was perfect. He was human, and he was God. Sacrifice for us. He says there, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from the dead works to serve the living God. You see, The old covenant required them to come again and again to offer sacrifices, to sanctify themselves, just so they could enter into the presence. But because of God's sacrifice of his own blood, he purges our conscience from the dead works so that we can serve the living God. He says, and for this cause, he is the mediator of the New Testament, and by the means of death for the redemption of the transgression that were under the First Testament, they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. He says, for this cause he is the mediator of the New Testament. For what cause? What did Christ do to cause him to be the mediator? He sacrificed himself. So this is for this cause, he's the mediator of the New Testament. Because he sacrificed himself, he's the mediator of this New Testament. And that they which are called might receive the promise of an eternal inheritance. Keep that in mind. Let's go to verse 16. He continues this thought of this greater testament. For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead. Otherwise it is no strength all the while the testator liveth. Whereupon neither the first testament was dedicated without blood. Okay, so he says there where there a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. We don't use that word testator anymore, but he's talking about the person that has given that testament. He says, if I testify of something and I've said, I said, this is who Christ is. We think of baptism and what baptism means in other parts of the world. What does baptism mean in other parts of the world? What did it mean for the Hebrews at the time? What did it mean for their families? What did it mean when the Romans came? It meant death, right? Baptism was a public action, right? It was a public demonstration of their belief in Christ. But what did it mean? What did they face after baptism? They faced death, the risk of death. And that's what he's talking about there. If a man's not willing to die for something they stand in, for the testament that they've made, you're going to say that basically all the Old Testament was old, and there's a whole New Testament of Christ. You're going to overturn an entire religious system for a New Testament, and you're not going to die for that? He says that's not a real testament. That's what he's saying there. For a testament is made of force after men are dead. Otherwise it is no strength at all while the testator liveth. It's the idea that if you're not willing to die for this groundbreaking new promise, it's not a real testament. He says, but who was willing to die for that testament? Christ was. He says, whereupon neither the first testament was dedicated without blood. He's going to connect here in verse 19, coming up into verse 19, that the first testament was dedicated with blood. Look at verse 19. For when Moses had spoken every precept of all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats, and with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the New Testament, which God hath enjoined unto you. Moreover, he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry, and almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no remission. When Moses was dedicating the tabernacle, what did he do? He dipped a scarlet wool and basically took a hyssop and scarlet wool and dipped it into the blood of calves and goat with water. And what did he do? He sprinkled it. He sanctified it. He spilled blood for the testament which God hath enjoined unto you. This is the blood which the testament which God hath enjoined unto you. He was sealing that testament with the blood of those calves and of those goats. So think about that. He says, moreover, he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and the ministry. Almost all things are by the law purged with blood. So we see that Christ was after that same example. Where was Christ's blood spilt? Where do we see Christ's blood spilt? On the cross, right? This is where Christ overcame or bared the sins for us. You can almost say the cross was a part of that new tabernacle. That was where that blood was spilled across. That testimony was sanctified. All right. I think we can finish this close. So we see lastly, the better sanctuary. the new covenant. It is therefore necessary that the pattern of things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves are the better sacrifices than these. For Christ has not entered into the holy place made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Again, we talked about the old tabernacle and the new tabernacle. Here he's comparing the old Holy of Holies with the new Holy of Holies. Where's the new Holy of Holies? It's not really new, is it? Where does he say it is? In verse 24. He says, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Christ is making intercession for us. He's going into the holiest, we call it the holiest of holies, but he's going to the holiest of holies, which is where? In the throne room of God. He's offering, he's the payment of our sacrifice. He's mediating for us to God himself. Not just the presence of God, as came in the tabernacle in a pillar, but actually the presence of God himself. So lastly, we see, it says in verse 25, it says, nor yet that he should offer himself often as the high priest entereth into the Holy of Holies every year with the blood of others, for then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world. But now once, in the end of the world, hath he appeared to put away of sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment, so Christ was offered to bear the sins of many. And unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin and unto salvation. So this should be your Christmas message today. This last summary that he gives at this very end here. Because you think about it, he says he offered, the former priest did what? He offered himself often, right? The former priest had to go in and cleanse himself continually. But he says there, for he must have suffered since if Christ had done that, he would have suffered since the foundation of the world, right? If Christ had to do what the priest did, he'd be suffering since the foundation of the world. But he says, what? But now once, in the end of the world, hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. One time Christ had to offer sacrifices. It was better than all the multitude of sacrifices the priest ever did. He says there, so Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and them that look for him shall he appear for the second time without sin unto salvation. The idea that Christ is going to come back to them that look for him. Remember, he's reminding them of hope. Where were the Hebrews? Were they like just hanging out in Jerusalem, worshiping God? No, they were under persecution, remember? They were struggling with their faith. And he says, if you continue to look for him, you will see him yourself without sin into salvation. You will go with him because he's covered your sin unto salvation. But the idea that Christ was offered to bear the sins of many, and he offered it once. He's the better promise. He's the better tabernacle. He's entered into the better tabernacle. He's the better high priest, better than any of the Levitical priests could be. So we think about what this means. It's been a heavy 3-4 lessons now. We see that God desires to dwell with us and in us. Remember, that's what the old tabernacle was, that God would dwell with us, that he would be a people with us. But the new covenant does what? He doesn't just want to be with us. He doesn't want to just be alongside us. What's he want to be? In us. He wants to dwell in us. Israel failed to sustain that covenant, but the tabernacle made of hands was just a shadow of what God's throne was. It was a shadow of the presence of God. It was a shadow of what heaven was. But Christ is the perfect high priest, and he's the eternal sacrifice who's entered into heaven. So that's the theological part. But think about the practical application. Our reliance on works fails to satisfy. If I relied on like the old priest to continue to offer sacrifices, continue to come to Christ, I'm sorry, but I didn't rely on who Christ was, right? I didn't rely on understanding that Christ was the better sacrifice. He says, our reliance on works is a failure to satisfy. Salvation begins with the heart. We've seen that in Malachi. We've seen it in Micah, where he says, if you're going to offer bad sacrifices to me, if you're not going to offer sacrifices from your heart, shut the doors. And that's what he's talking about. It applies to us today. That if we're not going to offer sacrifice, if we're not going to serve and come to Christ and commune with him, then don't even bother going to the tabernacle. Don't even bother turning to God in his throne room if we're not going to offer it with our heart. Trusting in what we're used to can cause us to miss what's most important. I encourage you, we didn't have time to study it in detail. Go back and read Exodus chapter 33. That's an interesting passage. That's a shocking passage when you think about what God was willing to do with the people of Israel. When he was willing to say, you all go into the promised land and leave me behind. As a people, are we putting ourselves in a place where we're willing to so want the blessings and things that God offers that we don't even realize it's God himself is the blessing that we should be seeking? The idea that Christ is the perfect work. He's the fulfillment of all the old covenants. If we put anything else before Christ, we failed. We're falling back into what the old covenant was. Christ is the better. He's the better sacrifice. He's the better priest. He's the better king. He's a better covenant. And so we'll be looking next week, actually continuing on in Hebrews 10, looking at him, Christ being the better sacrifice. Right? Any questions? I know we're over on time. Last thoughts? Well, thank you. Hopefully this was helpful. This was a long stretch for me to get here, but I appreciate it. Let's close in a word.